Welcome to the Backlash at Backlash.com. My name is Rod Van Mecklin, and in this video I'm going to read excerpts from my 1994 article, Domestic Violence, starting with a quote. Quote, "Don't accept rides from strange men, and remember that all men are strange as hell," close quote. That was second-wave feminist Robin Morgan in her book Sisterhood is Powerful. 1994, Bellevue, Washington. Using OJ to put the squeeze on men. From The Antics of Tonya Harding to Who Stole Feminism, a book by Christina Hoff Sommers that slams gender feminism, the feminist extremists had suffered one blow to their credibility after another. Then came the O.J. Simpson murder case, offering an opportunity for them to regroup with exaggerated claims of male aggression and domestic violence. But such exaggerations do more harm than good. To most of us, the Simpson murder case was a tragedy. But to certain feminist extremists, it was a goddess-sent blessing, providing an opportunity for them to regain ground lost during the previous year. The best of times to complain. In 1992, life seemed good for the media-designated leaders of the feminist movement. While second-wave feminists, Gloria Steinem and Susan Faludi, appeared on the cover of Time magazine, sounding a call to arms, Anita Hill toured the country accepting awards and lucrative lecture fees for making a mountain out of a joke about a Coca-Cola can by then, soon-to-be Justice, Clarence Thomas. It was the best of times for complaining that for women it was the worst of times. With each new victory, their confidence soared. The opposition was weak, the backlash more media myth than reality, and the gender quake of feminism was rocking the master's house to its very foundation. Patriarchy was under siege, and a rout seemed imminent. But their rout turned into retreat as proponents of equal rights and responsibilities began exposing their assertions of widespread female victimization by men as gross exaggerations. Lacking hard evidence to the contrary, there was little they could do until the Simpson case provided an opportunity for them to regroup. Using the grim scene of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman to magnify the problem of domestic violence. As the previous year should have taught them, however, wild claims do more harm than good. By late 1993, several authors were sending discordant aftershocks rumbling through the bedrock of public opinion with books like Naked at Gender Gap, A Man's View of the War Between the Sexes, The Myth of Male Power, and Not Guilty, The Case in Defense of Men, which protested the feminists' earlier exaggerations. At first, the extremists dismissed them as whining remnants of a dying patriarchy, but by mid-1994 they turned their attention to damage control when Christina Hoff Sommers, Who Stole Feminism, exposed their more valuable propaganda, such as the American Association of University Women's report, Shortchanging Girls, Shortchanging America, as biased at best. Tonya Harding and Lorena Bobbitt didn't help the feminist cause either, and the entire nation listened with amusement to their sputtered excuses for failing to unconditionally support Paula Jones' sexual harassment case against President Clinton. With another book by Warren Farrell and Kathy Young's pro-fairness book Ceasefire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality, both on the horizon, they desperately needed something to reestablish women as victims of male malfeasance. What they needed was a media event, a big one, and they got it. A timely horror. Nicole Simpson's murder made headlines the same day the Los Angeles Times Syndicate published novelist Catherine Dunn's article Crime and Perception that explained why the hysteria over murder and mayhem is based more on myth and media manipulation than true danger. For the feminists, the timing couldn't have been better, as the blood-soaked remains grimly mocked the idea most men are not murderous. Within days, the New Rage women were cranking out articles, statistics, and reports repeating the biased assertion that violence is a crime men do, and they do it to women. Quote, of the 4,936 female slaying victims reported nationwide in 1992, the latest year for which statistics are available, observed Jessica Siegel in the Chicago Tribune, 29% were killed by their husbands or boyfriends. That compares with 4% of male victims killed by wives or girlfriends, close quote. In another article titled Unsafe at Home, Seattle Post-Intelligencer reporter Tina Kelly quoted Carolyn Ford, program director at a Seattle shelter for abused women and their children, as saying, quote, "People think batterers are out of control, but that's not true. Generally, all they beat are their spouses, girlfriends, or partners," close quote. Kelly's article made no mention of abusive women, and the accompanying chart indicated all batterers are male. Where did this come from? It was, quote, "just something I had a feel for," close quote, Kelly said. The problem is, quote, 90% male, 10% female, close quote. How could a major metropolitan newspaper report a statistical distribution based on a reporter's feelings? Women batter equally. Women, according to every one of the more than a dozen studies, back then, now it's a lot more, that examined both male and female behaviors, perpetrate about half of domestic violence. Women, according to, I forgot the word women there. Women, according to every one of the more than a dozen studies that examine both male and female behaviors, perpetrate about half of domestic violence. This is supported by studies of lesbian relationships, which, according to Claire M. Renzetti's book, Violent Betrayal, Partner Abuse in Lesbian Relationships, are almost as violent as heterosexual relationships, 25% for lesbian versus 27% for heterosexual. And while it's true that of the 23,760 people murdered in 1992, 1,431 of them were female victims of husbands and boyfriends, compared to the only 753 male victims of wives and girlfriends. The article invites bias by suggesting this is a universal problem when, in a population of more than 250 million people, it's a lot more now, they represent less than 1/100th of a percent. It's simply not the epidemic that they make it out to be. Reporting otherwise detracts from the serious nature of spousal assault, murder, and domestic violence, and invites moral outrage, what feminists would call a backlash, and what we today call MGTOW. For example, indulging the pop psych jargon commonly used to immolate men, we might complain that ignoring female violence allows women to remain in denial and let them continue to deal in an unhealthy way with conflict resolution while still commingling with their children. According to the American Humane Association, 61% of child abuse is perpetuated by women. That was back then. I've heard that it's pretty close to the same today. Being victimized, no excuse for men. Suggesting such a pro-arrest policy would be unreasonable. According to the American Humane Association, 61% of child abuse is perpetuated by women. Would fewer children be abused if we incarcerated women more? Suggesting such a pro-arrest policy would be unreasonable, even biased, because it stereotypes all women on the basis of a violent few. But that's precisely the posture feminists take toward men. In the Simpson case, for example, some have suggested he may have been provoked. Not good enough, says Carolyn Ford. Quote, "Many people still believe that if you push someone far enough, they have the right to strike back at you, but no one has that right," close quote. Really? Then what of the battered woman syndrome defense? What of Lorena Bobbitt? Is there a double standard here? Whether applying double standards or opportunistically sensationalizing the violence of a very few men do, ultimately the feminists discredit themselves and, by association, the good causes they purport to champion. Better to tell the truth. Truth is, women and men created and inherited our society together. Regardless of our sex, we all have an equal capacity for love and hate, good and evil, and the ability to harm or to help. No one is to blame for this, but we do share equal responsibility for creating a sane society. Lying about men won't make that happen, only the truth will help. As Dr. Summers stresses, quote, "Truth brought to public light recruits the best of us to work for change. On the other hand, even the best-intentioned noble lie ultimately discredits the finest of causes," close quote. Wife battering. The battered woman syndrome gained prominence following the murder trial of Jennifer Patry in 1977, a case detailed by Stephen England in Manslaughter. That's two words, manslaughter. In it, he chronicles the defense attorney's successful portrayal of Jennifer Patry as a battered woman. England himself believed that argument until, after working with Patry and the other players in the case in preparation for his book, he reluctantly concluded she was more liar than victim, more jealous than battered. The battered woman syndrome was first and successfully used to defend a woman who was not battered. Moreover, many men complain women batter too. The feminist response has been a yawning dismissal. Quote, when the high incidence of domestic violence became an issue in the media in the United States during the early 1980s, a cry was heard from some corners that wives were beating husbands too. Subsequent studies, several, showed without a doubt that the number of such incidents is minuscule compared to the incidence of wife battering by husbands. Close quote. Share height, women in love. The problem with this is that it's dead wrong. Husband battering underreported. Most statistics of wife battering depend on researching crime statistics. These are numbers based on a self-selecting population. This is from a population comprised of both those who decide to report and those who decide not to report. That is, from a population comprised of both those who decide to report and those who decide not to report, only those who decide to report will be counted. Most who decide to report are women, and most who decide not to report are men. Hence, most cases of reported spouse battering involve women being attacked by men. There's no shame for a woman to report herself as a victim, but men who complain of being battered by women are liable to be ridiculed and ignored. It's not manly to be a victim. In the Handbook of Family Violence, Steinmetz and Luca reported that 1975 surveys based on randomly sampled populations found that men were battered by their wives by a 1.2 to 1 margin. 10 years later, that margin had increased to 1.47 to 1. Police statistics on spouse battering indicate between 12 and 14 cases of wife battering are reported for every case of husband battering, indicating husband battering is a seriously underreported crime. Perhaps only one case out of between 17 and 20 are reported. Beyond fear of being ridiculed for being henpecked, what else would prevent men from reporting their wives' abusive behavior? Perception and socialization could account for it. Men scarcely notice a jab in the ribs that would bruise most women. Moreover, growing up, boys routinely hit one another's shoulders with their fist as a means of demonstrating toughness. Most women, on the other hand, seem to have a lower tolerance for pain. So while feminists urge women to scream to the police every time their husbands take a swipe at them, which is the right thing to do, battering is assault, and assault is a crime. Most women may kick, pound, jab, and swat their men with impunity because men are supposed to be tough enough to take both physical and emotional abuse. Emotional battering. The idea of emotional battering is fairly new to the male reality. When I was an adolescent, being afraid of girls, for example, was considered a personal problem, not something we could blame on the opposite sex. Nor do feminists want us to realize how much women emotionally batter men because it would undermine their special status as victims. If someone is a victim, we can't hold them responsible for the harm they do in self-defense. But women commit a lot of emotional violence. Every woman who waits for the man she wants to date to come to her and initiate the relationship is exercising sexual dominance over men. Every woman who accuses a man of sexual harassment for asking her out on a date is guilty of emotional assault. Every woman who laughs at a joke about kicking a man's testicles is emotionally brutalizing men. Lashing out with words, they undermine the already bruised and scarred egos of men who subject themselves to this kind of abuse for only one reason: love. Motivated by the desire to love and be lovable, men repeatedly reach out, only to have their hands and faces slapped. After so much abuse, it can finally get to the point where many men get stuck in the act of initiating. Such men are commonly called Casanovas and Don Juans. They're the walking wounded, having been so emotionally battered by women that they've lost sight of the goal and obsessively ask for what, in their tightly capped grief, they can no longer accept: love. It doesn't stop there, however. After the honeymoon, many women prove the veracity of the old Irish saying, quote, "Before they got married, he thought she would never change, and she expected him to change. After the wedding, she changed, he didn't." Close quote. After the wedding, many women set about trying to change their men, and men often find that damned intrusive, rude, and abusive. If a woman wants a husband who will be a party animal, she should marry a party animal, not plan on making one out of her homebody husband. On the other hand, and what more often happens, women try to turn party animals into a guy who enjoys long walks on sandy beaches and sharing quiet moments watching sunsets, which is even more doomed to failure and is the height of stupidity. Note: those who believe in the theory of evopsych claim this is hardwired in our genes, and that may be true, although Diana Davison and others may also be right in claiming the theory is bogus. It should also be noted, however, that traditions evolved over thousands of years that tempered the stupidity that is excused by evopsych. Continuing. Women who try to change men are guilty of emotional abuse, but feminists rely on the Victorian concept of female moral superiority to dismiss such assertions. Insofar as they're concerned, women have the right to change men because women are morally superior. Any man who resists is, by their reasoning, guilty of violence against that superiority and should be eliminated. The process of elimination. Feminists and misandrists have a trick they like to pull, blaming men for their own violence. For example, quote, "My husband struck me twice, right after I struck him first," close quote. Share height, women, and love. Sometimes, because women don't learn the same prohibitions against using violence against the opposite sex that men do, they use it as an inappropriate mode of communication. Quote, "He refused to communicate at a vital time and I kicked him in the balls," close quote. Share height, women, and love. How often would men report themselves battered under such circumstances? Not many. How many women report men for domestic violence in instances that they, the women, initiated? What happens when a woman hits a man? If she misses his head or genitals, he's unlikely to take her blows seriously, and that makes her angry. Angry women can be dangerous. If they can't use force to get what they want for themselves, many will appeal to a higher authority, such as male police officers, to do it for them. For example, a woman strikes out at a man, bruises her arm when he blocks her blow, she calls the police, and the next thing you know, he's under arrest for wife battering. I've seen it happen. Or perhaps he hits her back, same result. He's guilty, she's the victim. And it doesn't matter whether she started it or not. Who would take him seriously anyway? Late in 1991, I received a threatening phone call from a woman who read an article on sexual harassment I'd written in one of the local newspapers. She said she and her, quote, "big girlfriends," close quote, were going to, quote, "come over and beat the shit," close quote, out of me. My first impulse was to laugh. Note, since then I've received so many death threats, crank calls, and hate email that I no longer pay any attention to them. But then a friend asked, "If you were a woman and a man called and said those things, what would you do?" Our culture encourages us to stereotype men as aggressors and women as victims, yet I was as much a victim of emotional violence as if I had been a woman and my caller had been a man. So I reported the incident to the police. Now, the threat was left on my answering machine. I think there was voicemail back then, but I didn't have voicemail. I had an answering machine, and I may still have the tape that threat was left on, but I played it for the officer, and he suggested that I should forget about it until he realized who I was, and I was a writer, and he filed a celebrity harassment report. I appreciated the special treatment. What bothered me was that it was special treatment. If I hadn't been a writer, would the entire affair have been ignored? Would I have been just another unreported statistic? Feminists complain that male officers do not take women's reports of domestic violence seriously. But the evidence requires us to ask, do they take men's complaints more seriously or less? Clearly, they take men's complaints less seriously than women's. And that works to the advantage of feminists in two ways. First, it eliminates the opposition. If there's little official evidence that women harass, intimidate, and batter even more than men, then we have little choice but to accept their assertion that women are victims and men are villains. Second, it inflates the impact of the wife battering statistics they cite. If women and men batter and are battered in precisely the same numbers, then we have parity, and it's a social issue rather than a women's issue that feminists can politicize. But if we reduce the reported number of incidents of spousal abuse against men, this increases the ratio of battered women to men, supporting the feminist claim that men are predators and women are victims. So what should we do? Ignore the problem, pretend it isn't there until men are virtual slaves? Do we rebel now and stage the inevitable backlash immediately? Do we demand equal rights and responsibilities for all regardless of gender? Or should we begin by exposing the feminist cover-up of male victimization? Well, that's up to you. 2015, Olympia, Washington. I wrote some sections of this chapter in 1991, others in 92, others in 93. I think others in 94, the final ones in 94. In the more than 2 decades since, conditions for men have improved very little. In divorce and custody cases, men still rarely get sole custody, and joint physical custody generally favors women, and women far more often than men receive child support. As I'm sure all of my viewers know, feminists have so poisoned Western society against men that it's accepted as received wisdom that we live in a rape culture in which all men are predators and all women are at risk of being raped by every man they see. And rarely are female abusers brought to justice, while a man may merely scowl and raise his voice to find himself under threat of arrest. Is it any wonder that more and more men are choosing to follow the example of John Galt in Ayn Rand's classic Atlas Shrugged and go on strike? There are lots of women in the West who are decent, good people, who are marriage material. I know this because I know a lot of women who are decent, good people. Sadly, many, if not most of them, are at least partly to blame for the pervasive misandry because they passively accept the benefits and say nothing about the bigotry against men. MGTOW is a rational response. But men are still men, and what are we to do with all that testosterone-driven energy? Borrowing a term from chemistry, Sigmund Freud called it sublimation, diverting the energy of a sexual or other biological impulse from its immediate goal to one of a more acceptable social, moral, or aesthetic nature or use. By focusing on getting rich, for example, making plans to start businesses, learn Spanish, and internationalize myself, that's what I'm doing to the point where it borders on obsession. Money in our modern society talks, so that's what I suggest all MGTOW do, focus on getting rich. An excellent book I recommend is Family Fortunes by Bill and his son Will Bonner. As I mentioned before, for the big picture, I'm following the blogs of Martin Armstrong at Armstrong Economics for trading and following Gary Savage, and sometimes I also follow the trades of Greg Mannarino, although I find it hard to make money on Greg's trades because it's harder with him to get the timing right, while the paid subscription service for Gary Savage, his recommendations are all about getting the timing right, so it's a lot easier. As usual, links to all three are below. That's all for now. Check out my other videos, subscribe to the channel. For the Backlash at Backlash.com, my name is Rod Van Mecklin. Oh my goodness, Burn Chapin at Chapin's Inferno has got nothing on me. This is 24 minutes now. Have a good day.